On Tuesday, Hong Kong's top court denied bail to media tycoon and Beijing critic Jimmy Lai. Mr. Lai is a devout Catholic and the most high-profile person to be charged under the city's national security law. Lai is accused of conspiring with foreign entities to endanger national security. He was originally detained in August 2020 after a police raid on his Apple Daily head office. He was released on bail, but then rearrested in December. Previously, those accused of nonviolent crimes in Hong Kong were granted bail, but the new law removes that presumption. China introduced the security law in the territory last year, saying it would ensure stability, but critics say it silenced dissent. More on this with Steve Mosher. Now I want to share this with you. This is Peter Mbarek. He is a World Health Organization official. This is his assessment of an investigation into the origins of COVID in Wuhan, China. Watch.
We also looked, for example, at the Wuhan Institute of Virology BSL-4 level laboratory and the state of that laboratory, and it was very unlikely that anything could escape from such a place. And we also know that when lab accidents happen, they are, of course, extremely rare. If you look at the history of lab accidents, these are extremely rare.
The Communist Chinese government finally allowed a WHO team into the country over 1 year after they had requested to investigate ground zero of this virus. What was actually learned, and can we trust the results of this investigation? Here with analysis is president of the Population Research Institute, author of The Bully of Asia, Stephen Mosher. Steve, I want to start with this WHO investigation. What were your thoughts after hearing this rather perfunctory assessment, a poo-pooing really, of the possible origins of this pandemic and that it broke out of that lab in Wuhan?
Raymond, this was a setup from the get-go. Many of us last January and February said this probably was created in a lab, the Wuhan Institute of Virology in Wuhan, China. It probably escaped from the lab or was deliberately released from the lab. We were called at that time conspiracy theorists by the same gentleman who was part of the WHO delegation to Wuhan, a fellow by the name of Peter Daszak, who works with EcoHealth Alliance. And Peter Daszak, who called me and others a conspiracy theorist, was actually in the business of funding research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And the money was coming from NIH, from Dr. Fauci's shop. So when you send the fox to guard the chicken coop, when you send the fox to report on what's happening in the chicken coop, you're probably not going to find out very much about what actually did happen. And as far as getting into the P4 lab, look, there were over a dozen delegation members. They were only in the Wuhan Institute of Virology for several hours. It takes 15 minutes to change clothes, shower, and get dressed with the protective equipment per person to get into the lab, and another 15 minutes to disinfect coming out. There's no way they could have been in the lab for any length of time, done any research, and left the lab. So I think that whole that was a show exercise. It was a propaganda exercise. They've had a year. In the last year, Raymond, they could have rebuilt the Wuhan Institute of Virology P4 lab from the ground up. We know they destroyed the results of hundreds of experiments.
Yeah, well, that was my thought. I mean, it took them over a year for the communist government to even agree to let this team that they practically own at the WHO to come in. There was plenty of time to destroy evidence, cover up whatever had been created there. Do you think anything was learned from this investigation, or was it all a sham?
I think it was all a sham. And look at what China's been saying about this from the get-go. First, they said a bat flew into someone's soup in Wuhan from a bat cave 800 miles away. Then they said that a pangolin, a little scaly anteater, was the host that had crossed over from the pangolin to humans. Then they said it came from the U.S. Army Fort Detrick's biological weapons lab in Fort Detrick, Maryland, brought over by the U.S. Army during the military games in October of 2019. Then they said, no, it came from a bat cave in 2013. Then they said, no, in 2017, a researcher was bitten by a bat in the lab. I mean, and now they're blaming the United States again. So if they've changed their story 6 times, that suggests to me a cover-up.
According to the WHO, as we heard earlier, it would be very unlikely that the virus could have escaped from that lab, and that accidents like this are very rare, Steve. The focus seems to be back on the wet market theory, that frozen food supplies could be to blame. But the same WHO has already stated back in January that there's no evidence to date of viruses that cause respiratory illnesses being transmitted via food or food packaging. Does any of this pass muster with you?
No, none of this makes sense. If you freeze an organism, most of them don't survive the freezing process. So the idea that it's coming into China on packages of frozen fish, for example, I think this is just a way of shifting blame overseas and also of punishing countries that happen to speak up about the real origin of the virus in Wuhan, China. They use economic warfare, the Chinese Communist Party does, and they're using it very effectively when it comes to the China virus.
State Department spokesman Ned Price had this to say. Listen.
I don't think there is any reasonable person who would argue that the coronavirus originated elsewhere. So that is why our focus is on this WHO investigation.
Now, John Radcliffe, the former director of national intelligence, told Fox News that, according to his sources, the Chinese military ordered the Wuhan Institute of Virology to begin experimenting with COVID strains as far back as 2017. Does that seem plausible? And does it square with what we're hearing from your sources, Steve?
Well, it absolutely does, because we know that the Chinese Communist Party's People's Liberation Army has been interested in developing biological weapons for a long time. It's part of their doctrine. I have documents in Chinese that I could share with people that state that the new high ground in warfare is the development of biological weapons, bioweapons that target specific ethnicities. Again, that target specific ethnicities. So that's what they've been working on. Everything in China that is high tech has dual use purposes. It has civilian use and it has a military use. When the breakout happened from the lab, I believe, of the China virus, the first person on the scene was the People's Liberation Army General Chun Wei, who's responsible for the biological weapons program. So what does this tell you? It tells you that she had oversight of what happened to the lab. It did come out of the lab. And as far as labs leaking, look, the SARS virus back a few years ago leaked from a P3 lab in Beijing twice, I think in 2013 and 2014. Twice it got out of the lab. So there's a long history of, especially in China, where they don't pay close attention to careful lab protocol, of these things getting out of the lab. So all of this
is very rare,
sham,
Steve. Very rare, the WHO says.
Well, it's very rare when they want to deny that their close partner of the Chinese Communist Party, who basically, I mean, they're working now for the Chinese Communist Party as part of this cover-up. And I think it's a grave mistake on the part of the United States to rejoin the World Health Organization when it's participating in fact, in covering up a pandemic that originated in China. And in fact, spreading false information. Remember last January, they were telling us there's no human-to-human transmission. That's why we're all wearing masks, right? Because there's no human-to-human transmission. So WHO is complicit in this. The WHO delegation visiting Wuhan was carefully selected and included people who were working with the lab on different research projects. So this was compromised by the get-go. We've got to keep digging, and we've got to hold China accountable for the trillions and dollars in damages, economic damages, and millions of lives lost from this pandemic, which was caused by China.
That's an interesting transition point. The Biden administration announced this week a new task force to address its policy toward China and the threat it may pose to U.S. interests. What are your impressions, first of all, of this task force? Is it credible? And is this new administration taking the threat of communist China seriously?
Well, the task force is being set up in the Pentagon, and I think what the task force will find is that the policy put in place beginning in 2017 by the Trump administration is precisely the right approach to China. We have to understand that China is led by a Chinese Communist Party that is hostile to faith, hostile to the United States, hostile to the free market, to democracy, hostile to the current world order, and wants to replace it with something modeled on Communist Party dictatorship. That's not a world that we want to live in. And remember, this is not a partisan comment for presidential administration after administration in the 80s and 90s and early years of this century. We had administrations, Democrat and Republican, that were thinking that China eventually was going to go our way. The Communist Party was going to moderate its stance. It was going to move towards the middle. It was going to allow the free market and human rights and other things. In fact, it's been moving in the opposite direction towards a fascist dictatorship, really not a communist dictatorship, a fascist dictatorship where you have elements of the free market, but only because they're efficient and they produce wealth. And the Communist Party is using that wealth to aggrandize its power and spread its influence around the world. So finally, over the last few years, we've gotten China policy right, and we need to stay the course. If we back away from that policy, we're going to compromise our own future, the future of our children and grandchildren.
On Wednesday evening, President Biden had his first call with President Xi Jinping of China. During that 2-hour call, the president raised China's human rights record as well as recent aggressive expansionism. Now, Xi has defended his policies as a matter of Chinese sovereignty, cautioning President Biden that a confrontation would be a disaster. How do you read in between the lines here? And are you convinced that the United States has a stance and a position now to warrant the respect of the Chinese?
Well, what we see China doing is drawing a series of red lines. And they say you cannot cross these red lines. And one red line is Taiwan. Taiwan is our sovereign territory, they claim, and you should not interfere when we try to retake Taiwan. South China Sea, another red line. You can't cross that red line. You can't criticize human rights in China. That's another red line. So they're trying to take things off the table, Raymond, so that we can't discuss them in these diplomatic exchanges. And they're only willing to discuss things that are to their advantage. So those are not the conditions under which we should be having these diplomatic discussions. We've got to press China on human rights. We've got to press China with regard to the genocide of the Uyghurs and the persecution of Christians and Catholics in China. We've got to stop them from seizing territory, not just in the South China Sea and making aggressive acts towards Taiwan, but, for example, building a port in the Bahamas, 100 miles off the coast of Florida, building artificial islands near Australia to put pressure on Australia, one of our good allies in the South Pacific. So China is moving aggressively on all points of the compass, and I think we have to challenge them on all points of the compass.
Are you surprised that President Biden has decided to leave the Trump-era trade tariffs in place against China? A wise move?
Well, it absolutely is a wise move because American free labor cannot compete with Chinese slave labor. And I use the word slave deliberately because we know that the Uyghur minorities and the Kazakh minorities in the far west of China are actually being sold in tranches of 100 to factories on the east coast of China to produce goods for export. This is literally slave labor. They're kept penned up during the week, only allowed out under escort for a few hours on Sunday afternoon. So that's slave labor. As far as the rest of labor in China, they're not allowed to organize, demonstrate, set up free labor unions. So they're a controlled labor force as well. Wages can be kept low. It is impossible for free workers to compete with that kind of serf and slave labor under the control, under the thumb of the Chinese Communist Party. So keep the tariffs in place and, in fact, move forward aggressively for rebuilding American industry and putting American workers back to work.
Well, Steve, it's a perverse irony, isn't it, that the Chinese loose this virus on the world, and now, this week, the Congress is moving an aid package, a supplemental stimulus package that includes a $15 minimum wage that will decimate small business and manufacturing. And yet, we're supposed to compete with the Chinese. It's rather remarkable if the Chinese did, in fact, orchestrate this thing.
Well, they certainly tried to take advantage of it, and they've taken advantage of it in multiple ways. One way, of course, is by selling literally 70, $80 billion worth of PPE around the world, face masks and protective equipment. So you release a virus on the world, and then you profit from that by selling at exorbitant prices the material you need to protect yourself against it. And of course, they're selling vaccines left, right, and center as well. Their vaccines don't work very well. The vaccines from China have a 50 to 60% efficiency, if that. That's what's claimed. So they're profiting from this mightily, and we need to be very clear-eyed about the fact that China poses the paramount threat to the world as we know it, and not just to Americans and to Europeans, but to the Chinese people themselves. Remember that there are 90 million or more Chinese who are not alive today because they were killed in various pogroms, persecutions, purges within the borders of China itself.
Were you surprised that the Biden administration decided to drop requirements put in place by the Trump administration for U.S. schools and universities to disclose their arrangements with the Chinese government-backed Confucius institutes? These are on-campus programs. Now, this was done without explanation at the end of January. Your reaction, and given that these institutes are basically fronts for the communist government, are you concerned about this?
Well, I am. I testified back in 2010 before the U.S. Congress on the fact that China was moving aggressively to set up propaganda outlets on American college campuses. And that's what these places are. These so-called Confucius institutes really should be called Xi Jinping institutes. They claim to teach the Chinese language, but they teach a history of China according to the Chinese Communist Party. They promote the idea that China has a superior form of government to American democracy. And they generally propagandize young Americans who are, my goodness, illiterate enough about American history and about the constitutional republic that they live in. They don't need to be exposed to propaganda paid for by the Chinese Communist Party, deliberately designed to undermine their faith in their own system of government and create an allegiance to a foreign power that is hostile to the United States and its values. And all the Trump administration had done was require colleges and universities to report their relationship to a Confucius Institute. They hadn't banned them. And now even that reporting requirement has been taken away. And I think that Beijing must be very happy about that particular action, and indeed about a number of actions that the Biden administration has quietly taken to take some of the pressure off China. For example, canceling the Keystone Pipeline. Some of that oil will now go to China. China is very happy about that. For example, canceling the requirement that no power generating equipment or power transmission equipment can be sourced in China because of the possibility that China may put a kill switch on a transformer and shut off electricity to U.S. cities in the event of a conflict. That's gone away now. That's under review. That will make Beijing very happy as well. So the rhetoric on China is still fairly tough, Raymond, but we have to be careful to watch what happens behind the scenes, because any softening of our stance towards China will be seized by them, by the hawks in China, to encourage more aggressive acts towards Taiwan, towards our allies in the Asia Pacific who are on the front lines.
Yeah. China's questionable treatment of Christians also continues, Steve. I mean, just this week, we're seeing reports that Christian churches in the Shandong province have been banned from publishing audio and videos of sermons, preachings from online gatherings and services. The decree banning such activity was posted on January 29th. What do you make of the action to ban these online services, Christian services, from being distributed? And the decree mentions maintaining public opinion security. What is that?
Well, public opinion security means that everyone has to adhere to the party line in China. And of course, the party line is that one should, if you're in China, be loyal to and indeed worship the Chinese Communist Party and its leader, Xi Jinping, and not engage in superstitious activities such as going to Catholic or Christian church services. But this is also kind of a bait and switch, because when they closed down church services in China on the grounds that they were places where the China virus would be spread, where COVID-19 would be spread, they told pastors and priests that they could broadcast their sermons online. Well, now, without reopening the in-person church services, they're closing down the online, the live stream church services. They're closing down audio and video recordings and making that a crime. And remember, back in 2018, they took responsibility away from the State Administration for Religious Affairs and put it in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party's United Front Department directly. So the Communist Party, which itself is a kind of pseudo-religion, is in charge of overseeing the real faiths of China. And what do they want to do? Well, they want to stamp out the competition, Raymond, and that's exactly what they're doing. They're afraid of Christianity in particular because it's spreading rapidly in China.
Steve, it's breathtaking, and the reportage on this in the United States is practically nil. I mean, but for this program and a handful of others, you're not going to hear anything about what's actually going on, not only behind the scenes in China, but in the minds of the Chinese officials. This is what they seek to impose, not only on their own people, but on the world. As you've written eloquently for so many years, they see themselves as the hegemon, the leader of the whole world, and the controller of the fortunes of the world. Before we go, we've got to talk about the current state of this Vatican-China agreement. Again, we still know nothing of the terms, but recently Cardinal Pietro Parolin gave an interview urging patience regarding the deal. He described it as a step-by-step diplomacy effort. Meanwhile, Asia News reports this week that China's State Administration for Religious Affairs has launched a database that contains all information on religious personnel. What do you know about this database, and what could the Vatican possibly be thinking in terms of this step-by-step diplomacy when it comes to a regime like China?
Well, the database by the State Administration for Religious Affairs was set up back in 2013, 2014. So it's been in existence for some time, and now they've moved the database to the United Front Department of the Chinese Communist Party. So everybody in China is literally being watched all the time. Especially pastors and priests are under 24/7 surveillance, trying to limit their effectiveness, trying to prevent the spread of the gospel. They won't succeed, but of course, the Communist Party is certainly trying. It now runs the world's first high-tech digital dictatorship, where everybody is being surveilled all the time. Some of you watching may have read George Orwell's 1984, where the authorities were watching through the TV screen. Well, that's real life in China today. They're watching you through your computer. They're watching you through your cell phone. They're watching you through the video surveillance cameras installed by the millions throughout Chinese cities. And so artificial intelligence, big data, people are being tracked, people are being watched. In fact, China is trying to create a database of everyone in the entire world, starting with the elites. If that isn't a wake-up call for the rest of us, I don't know what is.
Finally, we had that Jimmy Lai story at the top of the show. Your reaction to denying him bail and imprisoning this man. I mean, he's a man he's a media mogul, but I imagine a voice that's a threat to the regime, so they have to put him down.
Well, Jimmy Lai runs Apple Daily, which is the last free media in Hong Kong, which is now being crushed, under the hobnail boot of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think he's prepared for martyrdom. He has said in the past that he understands he may go to prison for the rest of his life. And prison in China, where he will probably be serving his sentence, is not a pleasant place. It involves torture. It involves sleep deprivation, minimal food, all sorts of pressure put on you, not just to serve out your term, which may in Jimmy Lai's case be a life sentence, but also to confess your crime. So we need to be praying for Jimmy Lai and his sons, who were also arrested, and for everyone in Hong Kong, from Cardinal Sin on down, who are all now in the crosshairs of the Chinese Communist Party for wanting what? For wanting what should be their birthright, the right of every man and woman to live free and breathe free and practice their faith.
Stephen Mosher, thank you for eloquently articulating the plight of these people that for too long have been ignored and continue to maliciously be ignored today by some of those in our own government and elites elsewhere. Stephen's book, Bully of Asia, is available everywhere, online and at bookstores. Steve, thanks again.
Thank you.